Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogue. This is our 18th panel discussion on the conflict, and so far we have brought together 52 top military experts, government officials, and think tankers from both sides of the Atlantic. It's been 8 months since Putin's February escalation of the conflict. On February 24th, Russia sent approximately 150,000 troops into Ukraine, thereby escalating the conflict. At the time, Russian officials assumed that Ukraine would fall within a matter of a couple of weeks. Until then, Russia was thought of as the second strongest military power in the world. But the February escalation has exposed Russia's decaying system while shedding light on Ukraine's growing resilience. In July, Russia even adopted an amendment law that effectively transformed its economy into a war economy. And so far, Russia's aggression in Ukraine has resulted in some 7 million Ukrainian refugees and 6 million internally displaced people. The number of displaced equals the entire population of a country like Rwanda. Mass atrocities continue unabated, including the mass deportation of Ukrainians, including Ukrainian children, to Russia and Russian-occupied territories. And as we speak, Kiev is under constant bombardment. Russia still holds nearly 15% of Ukrainian territory, and a recent poll by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology showed that 85% of ethnic Russian-speaking Ukrainians oppose any form of territorial concessions to Moscow. This pours cold water over Putin's claim that the special operation was set in motion to liberate Ukrainians, especially with regards to ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Western supplies to Ukraine has come a long way since the delivery of javelins and manpads earlier this year. While those weapons have made a major difference in helping Ukraine to defend itself, HIMARS have increasingly become instrumental in helping Ukraine to reclaim territories that were occupied by Russia. Now, Ukraine is asking for the delivery of ATACMS, or long-range missiles, to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. What has happened in the past 8 months? And what phases and trends can we identify in terms of the Russia-Ukraine war? More importantly, what can we anticipate for the months to come? To discuss these pivotal issues, I'd like to welcome 3 very distinguished experts. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Michael Kofman. He's the Director of Russian Studies at the Center for Naval Analysis and Senior Editor at the War on the Rocks. I'm very excited to have him here today, as he provides some of the best analysis on the Russia-Ukraine war that I've seen so far encountered. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Mariia Avdeeva, Research Director of the European Expert Association. Following the February escalation, she's been forced by circumstances to cover the Russia-Ukraine conflict as a war correspondent. She is the only expert that has joined us for a second time since we've started the Russia-Ukraine Dialogues. Welcome again, Mariia. Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Sir Lawrence Freedman. He's Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. He's often described as the Dean of British Strategic Studies, and those who follow him will be familiar with his cutting-edge analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war. Welcome, Sir Lawrence. Michael, I'm going to turn to you first. If you could unmute for me, please. Over the past 8 months, what are the main trends that you've identified on the battlefield? And what are the main changes that we need to pay attention to? Perhaps you could also situate this conflict for us in phases, if possible. Thank you. Over to you, Mike.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation to be on the panel. So it's not necessarily easy to periodize, but I think it's quite clear that there's an initial phase starting from Russia's invasion to about March 25th, where the Russian military attempts an ill-conceived regime change operation, a lot of which is based on terrible political assumptions in Moscow and the proposition that they might be able to effect regime change in a matter of days in the Ukrainian capital. And the overall campaign is planned for what looks like about 2 weeks. To be honest, it's not really planned because most Russian forces don't actually know the details of their plans until about 24 hours before the invasion, some maybe 72 hours. And so very little is organized, coordinated, and the entire effort is shambolic. So in the initial invasion, the Russian military takes very significant losses, right? And then it's forced to try to reconstitute, to attempt a secondary campaign, whose main focus is not just the Donbass, but also holding as much of the territory as they were able to occupy in the early days. But the Russian military very visibly has a structural problem. It has a big issue with manpower, right? The political leadership assumed that Ukraine wouldn't resist, and that they would essentially be able to catch Ukrainian political leadership cold and be able to overthrow the government in a matter of days. When all that was proven wrong and the initial invasion a disaster, the Russian military found itself without the manpower and with key bits of the force you might need for a prolonged war missing. And the Russian political leadership wouldn't fix these deficits, right? Rather than launch mobilization or announce wartime measures, understanding they were now in a very serious war that was expending a lot of the Russian military, they instead pursued piecemeal measures and visibly tried to tell themselves that somehow they could just win nonetheless and kind of grind the Ukrainian military down. So Russian military pursued a kind of plan B, which was a war of attrition, leveraging its massive advantage in fires, artillery firepower. They didn't have the infantry, they didn't have the forces, but they had the fires and ammunition. And the Russian military culturally has always been an artillery army, first and foremost, by design and by culture. This put Ukraine in a very difficult position by May and June. And as Ukraine was undergoing a transition, it was then able to increasingly assimilate and put into use Western equipment, Western artillery, and switch from Soviet ammunition, which it was rapidly running out of by May, to NATO standard ammunition, right? And Ukraine pursued a defense in depth strategy. It was sacrificing territory to an extent for attrition, as the Russian military was exhausting itself over the course of the spring and into the summer. And so the most they could gain were some bits in Luhansk and in the Donbass, which came ultimately culminated in the battles for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And then you see that the Russian military really begins to give up, lose momentum, give up initiative, and its fires advantage is starting to rapidly diminish thanks to the introduction of systems like HIMARS, right? Ukraine's disadvantage in fires begins to decline. Ukraine is able to capitalize over time on the fact that it has a massive manpower advantage. It's mobilized from the very beginning, right? It's been able to generate additional forces. It's been rotating troops on the battlefield. Ukrainian forces are not exhausted come July, August. Ukraine has new additional troops and it has fresh brigades. And Ukraine increasingly is able to take on board Western equipment as well and has additional shipments of Western ammunition. Whereas the Russian military is essentially exhausted. The Russian military can't effectively recruit. What volunteers they hired up, they were not sufficient to replace their losses. They can't conduct rotation. The entire Russian military was deployed in Ukraine. There was nobody to rotate them with, okay? And they have huge retention issues. Without introducing wartime measures, many people in the Russian military refused to deploy or refused to fight. And if they had rotated units back to Russia, then many people might quit. So to summarize this point, you see the big inflection point really then coming around August. It looks like a bit of an operational pause, but it becomes very clear to, I think, a lot of folks observing, certainly people like myself and Lawrence Freedman, who's also in this discussion, that Ukraine will gain the initiative and then be able to launch offensives once the Russian military had become exhausted. And you've seen the result of that in two concurrent offensives, one in Kherson and one in Kharkiv. Although they're distinct, that I think the concept of operations was different for each one, but nonetheless, they're both successful in their own way. I think looking out into the next month or two, I'll close out on these points, that Ukraine has a distinct window of opportunity, right? Both because the Russian military is clearly exhausted and quite vulnerable. Also because Russia has launched a process of mobilization. This is a very messy process from everything that one can tell. Conceived as a partial mobilization, in practice looking more like a phased general mobilization, and something that Russia hasn't attempted since World War II. And it's definitely playing out the way you might expect somebody trying to do something that they haven't attempted to do in over 70 years. It looks like it has all that efficacy and efficiency attached with it. But it introduces a degree of uncertainty. So I think Ukraine still has a very visible advantage on the ground and a momentum behind operations. That said, winter's looming, weather's changing. Winter won't necessarily halt operations, but it may change the potential for offensive maneuver. And that's, to be frank, weather does matter. Weather conditions and terrain matter in war. It's hard to ignore them. And we can perhaps discuss later in the panel what the future holds, but mobilization introduces a degree of uncertainty, right? It may not necessarily, from my point of view, change Russia's fortunes in the war. I like to think that quantity is not deterministic in any way. It does matter. It can't change the quality problems in the Russian force, and it can't change the big force employment problems that they've had, right? Perhaps I've used up enough time and best turn it over back to you so I can hear more from the rest of my colleagues on the panel.
Thanks, Mike. That was a really great introduction, providing us with sort of a 30,000-foot view of the conflict since the start up to now. So great summary. Thank you. I'm going to now turn to Mariia to kind of complement what you said there by specifically asking her to focus, on what's been happening in the East and South. But before I ask her a question, I want to thank you, Mariia, of course, for your coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war. You've gone to many hot spots, putting your own life at risk. And the images and videos that you post on Twitter from the field also show us, a glimpse of the human suffering taking place on the ground. And it's a constant reminder that this war is not just abstract, and it has real consequences. For those audience members who may not know, Mariia she's largely been covering the conflict from Kharkiv, which is less than, some 40 kilometers or so from the Russian border. She is currently in Kiev, which is, of course, under constant bombardment. So, Mariia, thank you again for joining us. Mariia, since September, the Ukrainian military has made major advances, especially in Kharkiv and Kherson. Can you tell us about the significance of those areas as well as the strategic value of those advances? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leon, for having me, for this invitation, and this is a big honor and a possibility for me to speak to this remarkable audience and to be in one panel with such speakers. This is truly a remarkable counteroffensive effort, as you mentioned, made by the Ukrainian army in Kharkiv and in Kherson. For me, it's especially important because I have been staying in Kharkiv since the beginning of the invasion, and I was there when the counteroffensive started, and that was the moment of real joy and pride for me as for other millions of Ukrainians who were seeing the great success of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield for which we were waiting for so long. Basically, the counteroffensive in Kharkiv, it started on the 6th of September, and the Ukrainian troops advanced so quickly. Since that, I have been several times just in the liberated areas around Kharkiv, almost in all important cities and towns that were liberated to the east and to the north of Kharkiv. And everywhere there, you would definitely see how quickly Russian army was retreating. Basically, they were running. And this was possible also because of the plot that probably the Ukrainian army has implemented. Because you all know that at the beginning, the General Staff of Ukraine announced that Ukraine is beginning a counteroffensive in Kherson, which is in the south of Ukraine. And Russian army had deployed there a lot of their troops, stretching their lines of defense around Kharkiv. And when this happened, the Ukrainian army was really and is continuing its counteroffensive on the south, but it was a big surprise for everyone, especially for the Russians, when this effort started around Kharkiv. And this was at the large possible because the Ukrainian army had the high precise Western weapons, primarily HIMARS. Because whenever in the liberated areas we went, I saw myself the destroyed Russian tanks and other military vehicles that were targeted by HIMARS, and also the destroyed munition depots and the bases where Russian troops and the Russian commander points were located. Ukrainian troops were forcing Russians to run or to retreat quickly, and it went day by day. We received more and more information about the new liberated areas. So for now, as of now, we can say that Ukraine has liberated more than 500 settlements and around 12,000 square kilometers in Kharkiv. So almost all Kharkiv region is liberated for now. The important cities or settlements I mentioned, they are Kupiansk and Izium, because they were very important for Russia because they were lying on the routes of supply. So basically the road by which Russian troops were bringing in military equipment and munition for Donbass. One of the routes, it lies through Vovchansk, then Izium, Kupiansk, and further to Donbass. And with the deoccupation, when these cities were retaken, it meant that the supply line of Russian troops was broken. And remarkable to see that Ukrainian troops were able to make it so quickly because there are some physical obstacles on the way. There are two rivers, Siversky Donets and Oskol, which Ukrainian army also pretty quickly forced and moved to the other banks of the river. So this is a remarkable scenes to see, but also these scenes bring a lot of grief, because when the areas were liberated, the scenes that opened there were horrifying. I'm sure that all of you have heard about the mass grave in Izium and the torture chambers. The torture chambers I have seen in every liberated settlement we have visited. So basically everywhere Russians were having these torture chambers where they held civilians captured in the while the territory was occupied. People in the liberated areas, civilians, still have very limited access to running water, to electricity. Basically for these 6-7 months, they were surviving only on what they had from their gardens or from the humanitarian aid from the Russians, because there was no other supply for them. People are preparing food for themselves on open fires outside. And add to this that the complete information blackout of the areas. So this is very important to understand, because this is the Russian tactics they imply everywhere on the occupied territories. They immediately cut off any kind of communication for the civilian population, especially internet and phones. And they start to push Russian propaganda 24/7. They print newspapers specifically for that region, and the people which lived under the occupation, they didn't get any information about what was happening in Ukraine at all. They were not even knowing very often that the liberation is close, because they didn't know what was happening outside. The only thing they knew was what Russian propaganda told them, and of course all of you are very well aware of what Russian state TV channels show in their prime time. And now the situation there is getting better, but it's far from normal, because, as I have said, a lot is damaged. Sometimes in some areas the devastation is just terrible, and still people need a lot of so electricity, water supply, gas supply should be restored. Then people need some basic necessities, and the humanitarian organizations are struggling to bring it to many of the liberated areas because Russians heavily mined the territories. It's still very dangerous to be there because it's like littered, actually littered with the mines, and you can only go by the ways, the roads that were cleared, and not you're not able to make a step out of the road. And add to this that still Russia continuously showering the areas close to the border with artillery and with missiles. Kharkiv gets struck almost every night, and the other areas to the north, to the northern border, and to the eastern border of the region, they are getting hit regularly, and civilians continue to suffer, and there are deaths among civilians almost every day. The reports come. Generally, for this period in Kharkiv region alone, more than 600 innocent civilians were killed after the Russian invasion and in the aftermath of Russian attacks. So I'm happy that now a lot of people in Kharkiv region can say that we are now in Ukraine. We feel that we returned back home, but there is a long way until the situation will normalize.
Thank you for that, Mariia, and we'll definitely come back with some questions to you also about what's happening in Kiev soon. But before that, let's go to Lawrence. Lawrence, in the context of some of the different phases of the war, what major changes have we witnessed in terms of NATO military supplies and support for Ukraine, and how has NATO support for Ukraine impacted this war? Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been incremental, I think is probably the best way to understand it. Before the war, the UK, the US, Poland, some other countries did provide a kit to Ukraine, particularly for defensive purposes. Really, after 2014-15, there's been military assistance training, which turns out to, I think, to have been quite important. But at the start of the war, there was great caution, I think, as to how far this would go. I'm sure you recall Zelensky's statement right at the start when it was suggested that he evacuate, when he said, "I don't want to ride, I want ammunition." And that was a very clear message that he sustained ever since. I mean, if you want an example of good political messaging, this was it. He tailored it to every country, and he's made it clear that Ukraine will struggle without Western support. Certainly, as Mike indicated, when you were looking at the summer, it was very difficult, I think, for Ukraine to cope with the attritional tactics of the Russians without the prospect of being able to move to a more offensive posture of their own, which required different sorts of weapons to the ones that were being provided right at the start. And I think you have two things working initially, sort of cautioning NATO countries. The first was an assumption that Ukraine might lose and lose quickly, in which case, what's the point? And the second, which is a different concern, was of escalation, that if NATO got too involved, then this would be seen by Moscow as a trigger for a wider war, possibly including nuclear weapons. What happened, I think, was the combination of Zelensky's messaging, the fact that the Ukrainians showed resilience, showed they could fight back, pushed the Russians back from Kyiv and elsewhere. encouraged potential donors to donate. And I think that also they had to get over the idea that the Ukrainians somehow couldn't cope, that this was all too complicated for them, and the training would take too long, and so on and so forth. And obviously, the longer the war goes on, the more time there is for training. So I think and then I think you also have the impact of the atrocities that we saw, which Mariia has already mentioned, and sort of the recent revelations. Of course, those revelations were there almost as soon as the area around Kyiv was liberated and the Russians had pushed back. I think that had a very big impact on Western opinion. This was a country that really had to be supported. But it took time, and it really took to the summer before you get the authorizations coming through that allows Ukraine to start moving on to the offensive. And I think what's been impressive is first that they haven't had any trouble, as far as one can tell, using this. I mean, there are issues of compatibility, that not all Western countries are compatible with each other, and it's actually quite a challenge to integrate different types of systems into your force structure. There were concerns, you can see them expressed in the States, may say more, that given past corruption in Ukraine, that some of this kit would disappear and so on. I asked when I was recently in Washington and was told that there wasn't any evidence of that at all, that it's all doing what it should be doing. Now I think we're moving to a situation where there's I think there's two issues. This is simply sustaining the effort you've got. This is very high intensity warfare. And Western stocks have been depleted. I mean, so fortunately of Russian stocks, but this is an issue, and sustaining that is an issue. And then Ukrainian needs are becoming clear. And obviously at the moment, the main issue is defensive systems, because Russian tactics are very focused on making life as miserable as possible, as I'm afraid Mariia knows, for ordinary Ukrainians, and attacking power supplies in particular. So the demands are not going to go away, and they'll continue. Russian tactics also have been to dissuade the West from supporting Ukraine by imposing high energy costs, energy shortages, disrupting Western economies, all of which has happened. It's not trivial stuff. But as yet, what's striking, and Mike and I heard yesterday some recent American polling, it hasn't affected support for the war particularly. If anything, it's strengthened in Western countries. They blame Russia, and I think that's a key thing. So for the moment, I think, despite everything the Russian tactics are basically coercive to Kyiv and coercive towards the West, but they're not quite coercive enough. And so far, I think they've been resisted, but one shouldn't underestimate the costs of resisting either.
Thank you, Lawrence. Those are all great points, and we'll circle back to some of those issues momentarily. But let's first go to Michael again. You kind of set yourself up earlier in one of the things that you mentioned, and this is an issue that you've doggedly, I would say, and rightfully so, paid attention to since the February escalation, and that's the issue of manpower of the Russian military. And ordinarily, I don't like to use that word manpower necessarily, but I do think in the Russian context, it's probably the right term. Talk to us about that issue and situate that also for us in the context of Putin's call for a so-called partial mobilization and the Wagner Group's seemingly desperate attempt to recruit prisoners. Will those actions realistically solve Russia's manpower issue? Thank you, Mike.
Okay, let me try to put this maybe as succinctly as I can. So first, in terms of understanding the basics of the war, Ukraine is, outside of Russia, the largest country in Europe. It's a vast country with cities with a large population. The proposition that you can invade and occupy any country is usually one that requires a huge amount of manpower, right? The United States recently had this experience in Iraq, and Iraq was a much smaller country with a smaller population than Ukraine back in 2003. Okay, first. And second, keep in mind the externally imposed regime change operations usually go wrong. It's either an invasion phase or it's in a stabilization occupation phase, but historically these things rarely have a good ending for the aggressor, just to begin with. So in that regard, this war is actually performing closer to expected historical outcomes of these kind of terrible ideas. That said, here are the challenges the Russian military had. First, the Russian military was built as a tiered readiness force based around the need for partial mobilization, which they did not go through because Putin clearly believed that this would actually be something like a special operation, a sort of perhaps derivative of Operation Danube, the invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68 or something like that. And keep in mind also, the Russian military, in constructing the force through the 2000s, made trade-offs. I'm a person that focuses a lot on force structure and force design. I like conversational tactics, they're interesting. I like conversations on logistics, they're also very interesting. And I love conversation on operational art. But I'm a person who usually says, show me your force structure and I tell you who you really are, because it involves the real trade-offs and choices you've made. And whatever happens beyond the initial operation, more importantly, I'll be able to tell you how you're going to end up fighting, no matter what you've written in terms of really neat concepts of operations. If you have no infantry, you're not going to be doing well fighting for cities. You're going to be doing well in combined arms. Much of the military will be stuck on roads because the vehicles and tanks won't be able to get off road. They'll have no infantry to screen them. And you have a very hard time holding terrain and trenches and the like, which is the situation Russia found itself. Not only that, very few troops for the invasion. I think the total invasion force might have been around 150,000 personnel, but only a fraction of that was the regular Russian military, okay? Because Russian battalion tactical groups, as it turned out, were quite small. An important percentage of that were mobilized personnel from LDNR, Luhansk Donetsk region, and Rosgvardia. As the war had gone on, Russia lost a lot of the infantry they had in the force in the first couple of weeks. So their choice not to have much infantry in the force and to build a military around a short, sharp war with NATO put them in the worst possible position for an attempted invasion and occupation of Ukraine, right? And as the war dragged on, it became very clear that the Russian military had a dearth of manpower, it had a particular shortage of infantry. It was increasingly dependent on non-regular troops. Over the course of the month, you actually see less and less of what seems like a cohesive Russian military and more mobilized personnel from occupied regions of Ukraine, various volunteers that they hired up across Russian regions to fill in volunteer battalions and replacements. But this is not the same thing as an actual military that previously existed, with real personnel and units that had some training, some organization, what have you. And Rosgvardia and these other units. In fact, for example, in the Kharkiv offensive, the first units Ukrainian forces encountered west of Izum were actually 2 Rosgvardia companies. Okay, it wasn't even the regular Russian military. Not only was there a dearth of manpower stretched thinly across these vast lines, but also was not a very cohesive force. You had lots of different people involved in it. And on top of that, okay, you had a growing role for Wagner. Ever since the breakout at Popasna, Prigozhin had tried to leverage Wagner to advance himself. He started an internal fight within sort of the Byzantium that is Russian politics, trying to attack Russian generals for weak performance as a way to get after Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. Wagner troops have been combining with other Russian troops as an assault force. In fact, they're still prosecuting strategically a meaningless offensive at Bakhmut, the Seversk Bakhmut line in Donetsk. Well, strategically, it's only meaningful for Prigozhin because it's part of his attempt to show that Wagner is making gains while the rest of the Russian military is losing. But in terms of actual military relevance, it has none, especially after the Russian defeated Izum. It's no longer militarily relevant in any way, shape, or form. All right. So what happened to the Russians' force structure is over time, it got thinner and thinner. And the big choices they had made in force design, one of the other ones they had was that they largely assumed that strategic ground offensives were a thing of the past, right? That the fight with NATO was going to be a lower density of forces fight based around the fragmented battlefield without forces holding static lines and trenches like they had in World War I and World War II, right? And that a lot of the fight would be focused around standoff, fire and strike, different means of intelligence reconnaissance, and also airspace attack and airspace defense. It's no secret that the United States is strongest as an expeditionary airspace power. We're strong in other categories too, but probably our biggest strength, where we have a lot of the firepower, is in the U.S. Air Force, right? And if you can't do much about the U.S. Air Force, it's usually just a question of time as to when a conventional force will be defeated. All right, so that military actually did not have the logistics and the force structure for strategic ground offensive, and it's very visible in Ukraine. It didn't have a number of the components you would need, they might have needed, to conduct a large-scale operation of the kind that they had done. And lastly, where militaries often fall flat is on scaling force employment. What any military can do with 3 battalions or a couple of brigades, they may not be able to do with 100,000 troops, not at all. Scaling is very hard. Scaling complex operations is very hard. That's when logistics, communications, a lot of the enablers come into play, right? In the past, we'd seen the Russian military use small amounts of force. That's where you can use your better forces. That's when you can rotate troops in and out of a fight, and you essentially control a lot of parameters of the operation. When the Russian military tried to scale something they hadn't done in many, many decades, none of us had seen it. And you couldn't tell from exercise either, because a lot of Russian large exercises were scripted events. They were closer to military theater than they were to like a real exercise, okay? And that theater had acts. It was like a Shakespearean play. You could watch it play out. If you covered over the years like I did, it had clear planned acts and events. It wasn't a real kind of dynamic thing. So the Russian military fell flat in attempting to scale operations. And you saw that they had a huge amount of problems, from force employment to sustaining the force to commanding and controlling the force. And a lot of the concepts of operations they had weren't all that mature either, because the things they could do in a more controlled environment like Syria, they could not replicate in Ukraine on a larger scale. Okay, I probably spoke too long. I'm sorry. I hope this was a modest foray into the conversation of force structure, force design, and why employment at scale makes a big difference.
Thanks, Mike. I know how much you love this issue. I know we can do a whole few hours on this issue just with you, but thank you for your take on this. Mariia, I'm going to go back to you. The Kremlin is now also heavily targeting targets in Kiev, or I should say once again. I know you visited several of the scenes yesterday and today that have been hit hard by Russia. What have you witnessed, and very importantly, what is Russia's strategic objective with those strikes? Thank you.
Yeah, what is happening in Kiev, it started, like I would call it, the new phase of the Russian offensive. It mainly started 10 days ago, last Monday, and this new strategy lies in constant, deliberate strikes, massive strikes of the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, meaning that Russia uses missiles and kamikaze drones to hit hitting electricity stations and water supply. And Russian media praise it, and they like deliberately and openly admit that they target civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. The Ministry of Defense of Russia made several reports about that, how precise they are. But of course, all of you know that Russian missiles are very highly unprecise, and this leads that some of these missiles and drones hit residential areas, and that happened yesterday. The 2 drones actually attacked the area around one of the power stations in central Kiev, and one of the drones hit the 4-story building. The large part of the building collapsed after that, and today the 5th body was recovered from under the rubble. I've been there yesterday, just after the strike, and I've seen the body that was taken out of the rubble. And this new Russian tactics leads also, it actually aims to influence the morale of the Ukrainians, because the weather is getting colder. in Kyiv and everywhere in Ukraine, and now it was officially today confirmed by the Ukrainian authorities that 1/3, 30% of all Ukrainian energy infrastructure was not completely destroyed, but was damaged because of the Russian attacks. And the people today were several times repeatedly asked to cut down the use of electricity, use of water. Everyone warned the Ukrainian that from now on, you have to have the power banks and that the supplies of water ready at home in case there will be the cut-offs. And actually, where I am now, the light was going on and off several times during the day. In some areas of Kyiv, there is still no water supply. And this is what Russian tactics is now. And we see that it's continuing because the attack I'm describing on the residential building happened yesterday. Altogether, 5 Shahed drones hit Kyiv. A big number of them was shut down, but some of them made it to the city. Today, again, in the morning, there was a massive air raid for Ukraine, and there was another massive strike. The cities of Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Dnipro were hit. Kharkiv was hit also, but from the territory of Belgorod, where Russia uses the S-300 missiles, which they have a lot of. And the military intelligence just now said that Russia has bought a lot of these Shahed drones, meaning a lot, but 1,750 from Iran. And Ukraine manages to shut down around 70% of what's being fired for Ukraine, but still the number of damage is really high. And the importance of what was damaged, because this critical infrastructure, it means that without the heat and electricity and water, it won't be possible for the large Ukrainian cities to go through, to survive and go through the winter. And this resulted in Ukraine said that Iran should not for further sell the drones to Russia, and the sanctions should be put on Iran. And today the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, proposed to cut the diplomatic relations of Ukraine with Iran, because the Ministry of Foreign Affairs named Iran the accomplice of Russia in the committing of war crimes, because targeting with military means critical civilian infrastructure is clearly a war crime, and the civilians are also suffering not only from the consequences, but directly, because today, again, at least 2 people were killed in Kyiv because of the attack.
Thank you so much, Mariia. And I'd be very interested in the other 2 speakers also, if they have something to say when it's their turn on this issue of the so-called new phase that you mentioned of this war, because I do think it perhaps also ties in with the issue of manpower and the other discussions we've had earlier on. But let's first go to Lawrence again. Lawrence, now we often focus on Russian failures in Ukraine, and that's also what Mike talked about earlier on, but we sometimes also fail to acknowledge Ukraine's success. What's the significance of Ukraine's achievements up to now? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think the starting point is I'll call it an asymmetry of motivation. The Ukrainians know what they're fighting for. They know the terrain in which they're fighting. the Russians aren't sure what they're fighting for, and they have, as Mike indicated, sort of cobbled together units, shortages. Ukraine mobilized early. That was important. I think people have been impressed by the command and control and strategies that have been adopted. The contrast between using your artillery to batter cities or your long-range missiles to take out infrastructure, which, as Mariia said, is a war crime, and using it to take out ammunition dumps and logistics and command and control posts is striking. So you've almost got two different sorts of wars going on. You've got a war which is about classic military operations, and I mean, what the Ukrainians are doing is not that surprising in terms of military strategy. It's just that the Russians didn't operate that way, and the Ukrainians are doing it pretty well. And I think the ability to take advantage of the move of Russian troops to Kherson to deal with that challenge, and then take advantage of the thin lines of defense in Kharkiv was very impressive and done well. And clearly the Russians, if they did see it coming, weren't able to respond in time. So you've got that sort of war going on, which is a war that I think First and Second World War generals would understand, even if they didn't understand all of the technology being used. And then you've got this other war, which is being directed against civilians and civilian infrastructure, which is a test of resilience, and the ability to repair, to take emergency measures, and so on. And I think the ability to defend, and as mentioned, the amount of stuff that's being knocked out is significant. And I think when it comes to missiles, this is a limiting factor. But these drones are quite plentiful, and that's more of a challenge. And you have to rely on inaccuracy. But again, as indicated, just because it misses an important target doesn't mean to say that it doesn't hit anything. So you've got these two different sorts of campaigns going on, and the question for the future is, can Ukraine sustain itself, stay resilient? And again, I think it will, because it has no choice, but it's not a comfortable situation. While can Ukraine make progress on the battlefield, which in the end is going to be the most important factor, because that takes you to the point where one hopes at some point Moscow realizes its position in Ukraine is untenable, and its military can't really take much more losses. So, and also I think we haven't talked much about what's going on in Russia, but the blowback from the botched mobilization has already been quite significant. It did make a difference. It did bring the war home to ordinary Russians in a way possibly it hadn't been brought home before. So I think in the end, a lot of this stuff, we're waiting to see how Moscow politics develops, and whether a point is reached when they realize that they can't win this war, and that if they carry on going as they are, that their military will be even more depleted, and the military's reputation further down. So it's a tough contest, and I think the winter is going to be very important in seeing how that plays out.
Thank you, Lawrence. On that last point, Mike, I'd like to turn to you also, taking into consideration sanctions and the impact of those, and as well as Russian losses on the battlefield. What's Russia's ability to economically sustain this war?
Well, I'm not an economist, but just to be frank about that, but I think that most of the worst implications for the Russian economy are yet to come, and they've begun to be really felt after September. I think overall you're going to see a steady disconnection of the Russian economy from the global economy. You will see a huge amount of inefficiencies in the Russian economy. You'll see a number of commercial sectors that are dependent on foreign imports of parts and supplies essentially shut down. And you'll see a great deal of retrograding back towards autarky, which is producing lower quality goods, goods of lower technical quality as well, in an attempt to pursue self-sufficiency. In many ways, I think Russians will try to model themselves closer to Iran in how they deal with sanctions. Now, regarding the implications for economic sustainability of the war, I would be very careful in caution people in assuming that finances are at all going to be the challenge for Russia in this conflict. The real issue is defense industrial capacity. So large conventional wars ultimately come down to attrition, replaceability of material, manpower, and munition, and they consume it at dramatic rates. All right. So Ukraine's war effort in many respects hinges on sustainability of external Western support, equipment and ammunition at this stage. Yes, it very much is due to Ukrainian will to fight and the availability of fighters and manpower, but the equipment and ammunition in many respects is very much ours, as is a lot of direct support. On the Russian side, the question is how well can Russia sustain it? The challenge I think people have had is that they are looking for impact of sanctions and export controls of Russian defense industry on a timeline in which it's not going to actually have impacts yet. A lot of that is yet to come, likely from my point of view next year and thereafter, okay? Defense industry doesn't work the same way commercial supply chains work typically. It's more resilient, more autarkic, but Russia will have a lot of issues across the board. They'll have supply chain choke points. They'll have challenges mobilizing production. They are only now starting to get after a large-scale process of really getting equipment out of storage, out of warehouses, refurbishing it, and the like. Across the board, I think in many respects, we've been fortunate because they've done everything slow and rather late. You know, that's why I've often described Putin as a sort of master procrastinator. He typically dithers on decisions, waits for all the options to go from bad to worse, and only then takes politically risky decisions like mobilization and committing the regime actually to the war, right? Whereas it would have been a much more dangerous course of action had Russia enacted these measures back in April when the initial invasion failed, right? And I think to a number of analysts, it's very clear that either Russia enacts some form of mobilization or it is very much going to lose the war because the force simply wasn't there for them to actually prosecute this war against Ukraine, especially Ukraine with sustainable Western backing. I think Lori was very much on the same page regarding that too. It looked very clear as far back as April. All right, so to wrap up on this point, on the defense industrial side, there's a good deal of uncertainty. And I'll put it this way. Yes, there'll be big challenges that Russia has. Yes, they will also work past those inefficiencies. I think they're going to have a very difficult coming year. And this year, especially, is probably a bigger window of opportunity for Ukraine. But no, there are many things they're not going to run out of, or they're not going to run out of them quite yet. Okay, the tank industry is not the automotive industry. It's not nearly as dependent on foreign components and things like that, right? And many of the stories that come out earlier in the year about this and that shutting down in Russia, well, I hate to tell you, a lot of this really, frankly, isn't true. If anything, it's been very clear that they've increased shifts, they've mobilized production, and they've increased defense spending on procurement by over 40%, you know, well over another sort of 600 billion rubles or so that's been added to it. So they are trying to increase defense production as much as they can, but it's never going to meet the rate of consumption. You can see, for example, that Russian rate of fire precision guided weapons dropped off tremendously over the course of the summer. But they're essentially making them and using them and making them and are largely firing them at about the rate that they make them. And this is why they're increasingly dependent on imports from countries like Iran, for example, using Iranian drones and loitering munitions. So yes, the sustainability is going to be a challenge for Russia as well. It's going to be very uneven what they can make versus what they can't and where they have production choke points. But folks also need to kind of temper some of those expectations in terms of when they would begin to see it and not kind of fall into these endless news stories that, oh, here we are, Russia's already run out of its ability to produce this tank or that tank. This stuff just hasn't been true. I just want to be very honest about it.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to turn back to Mariia and just kind of linking what Lawrence and Mike also said. Basically, this war is not just dependent on Russia's weakness, but also the strength of Ukraine and its ability to fight. Also, at the end of the day, it takes two to tango, right? So, and over the last few months, we've seen the importance of the difference that HIMARS have made, the introduction of HIMARS to Ukraine's ability to defend itself, but also in the counteroffensives also. And now Ukraine is starting to put more emphasis on the delivery of ATACMS or long-range missiles. What are Ukraine's arguments for the delivery of those systems and those weapons, and why are some NATO members reluctant to supply ATACMS? Thank you. You're muted.
Great question. Thank you, and I will try to be quick as possible, not to take too much time. So the difference, the HIMARS did, I already mentioned when we were speaking about the liberation of Kharkiv, but also other high precise Western weapons, including that is supplied by Britain and other allies. It makes huge difference on the battlefield. I've been to numerous units on the front lines which said that at the moment they receive the Western weapons, the situation changes drastically, because before they were just able to defend the position, that's all, with the weapon they had. When they received the new weapon, they were able to push out Russians. And this is a very important to understand for those that you have mentioned are reluctant to supply Ukraine with weapons. Ukraine uses weapons to push out the Russians from its territory, which allows to protect civilians, because the closer the Russian troops are to the people living in Ukraine, to the civilian population, the more intensively they attack these territories. And we have seen this both in Kharkiv and in the liberated areas of Kherson. We now see the same, what is happening in Zaporizhia, right, where the big part of the region is occupied by the Russian troops, and they continuously shell residential areas in Zaporizhia and south. And to change the situation further, Ukraine needs more longer range missiles, because this is used to break the Russian supply routes. This was critical in already in the counteroffensive, a successful counteroffensive Ukraine made, and this will be more critical in the Ukrainian push of the Russian troops further out of its territory. You have seen from the numerous Ukrainian officials that the aim of Ukraine in this war, to win this war, Ukraine needs to regain control of all the occupied territories. And to do that, to hit and to get the commander centers, the ammunition depots, and the supply routes of the Russian troops occupying the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine needs other type of weapons. This is longer range missiles, and what is more important now is more anti-aircraft weapons, because we have already touched it, as Russia is using more and more drones which are unable. So Ukraine, with what we have, Ukraine is unable to see them with the radars. So the kamikaze drones, people just see with their own eyes, and then they just physically see them. This, of course, is not allowing to shut them properly, and for that, new anti-aircraft, modern anti-aircraft systems are needed. Ukraine is a West country, so we need a lot of that new military equipment, and that is why it's important for those in the West who are still hesitant. They usually say, we do not want to provoke Putin for more. Putin already has done everything, and he has used all kinds of weapons Russia has, except for the tactical nuclear weapons, with which he threatens the world. But we are not provoking Putin. We are trying to defend civilian population because now when Russia openly admits that it hits specifically targets critical civilian infrastructure, supplying more weapons will help to defend Ukrainian cities and save lives of the innocent civilians.
Thank you, Mariia. We'll see how the images of these missile strikes against Kiev will also perhaps change the discussion in some of the Western capitals. Lawrence, let's turn to you. We have numerous questions from audience members like John Newman and Derek West about, on the nuclear question. What do you make of Putin's nuclear saber rattling? And also, we also know that the NATO nuclear planning group met a few days ago. What options do NATO members have in terms of responding to Putin's nuclear threats? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an issue you have to be very careful with, because there's lots of different nuclear issues being discussed all at the same time, and they have very different implications. My view, and it's been from the start of the conflict, that Russia has a very clear role for its nuclear weapons, which is to deter NATO from getting involved directly. Putin gave a press conference at the end of the CSTO summit in Astana. Right at the end, there was what seemed to me a pretty planted question, which basically said, what do you do if NATO comes in to solve Ukraine's problems and fights? And many times there's been terrible destruction, world destruction. I think that's been the position from the start, and it's worked. You know, NATO has been deterred. That's why NATO did not put in a no-fly zone, for example, early on. One reason why the very long-range systems have not been supplied, because Biden is concerned about escalation, and so have others. So NATO has been deterred. For that matter, Russia has been deterred. It hasn't attacked neighboring NATO countries that are important supply hubs to Ukraine. So it's contained the conflict. So the first thing you have to keep in mind is, does Putin want to jeopardize that by use of nuclear weapons? And I don't see why he would. I think it would be all bets off as soon as nuclear weapons were used. No, I don't think that NATO would necessarily need or want a nuclear response. There's lots of things NATO could do which wouldn't require escalating in that way. I mean, you can keep Putin guessing as to what might happen, and that's fine. But in practice, I don't think it would be necessary. Now, when you get so-called tactical nuclear weapons, you've got to ask what difference it makes in battle. They're actually quite difficult things to use. You need people can see when you're. If I have a worry, it is intelligence will pick up activity which seems to relate to tactical nuclear weapons, because we know that Western intelligence is watching pretty closely, and that might send alarm bells ringing and so on, which can have its own dynamic. But by and large, you can see what's happening. A lot of the systems that would be used, would have their own problems of reliability. These things haven't been tested properly ever, really. So they might work fine. I mean, if I was planning for it on the other end, I'd assume that. But if I was a Russian, I'd worry that it might not work as intended. You have places where Ukrainian and Russian forces are intermingled. They're not easy things to use, and you have to ask, would you break this taboo? Would you cross this big line for what may be quite a limited military gain, especially if you're not using them in any number? And if you're using them in number, then there's not even a question that this is tactical. So it's a high-risk strategy for the Russians. I think they are quite happy that people worry about it. I think it encourages calls for ceasefires and negotiations and so on. But I'd be very surprised if they wanted to jeopardize the real benefits they're getting from nuclear deterrence at the moment by actually moving to nuclear use. So that's my, every conversation one has on this, one ends up with the fact that Putin's taken, at least one and many other pretty stupid decisions. And you can't assume therefore that he won't take more really stupid decisions. We're far too dependent in this conflict on the thought processes of this man. That's why you can't put hand on heart and say it won't happen. There's a non-negligible chance it might, but it doesn't seem to me likely. As Maria's pointed out, that it's not as if he's short of ways of making life miserable, of causing harm, of causing destruction, or even particularly short of firepower. That hasn't been the great Russian problem. So yes, we have to pay it attention. I think there's other things to look at and worry about. Frankly, if he was really intending to use nuclears, I don't think he would have gone to mobilization. Mobilization was his big option, and that's what he did. But he's quite happy for us to worry about it.
Thank you, Lawrence. We are all worried. Let's go to Mariia. I know you have to drop off very soon, so I'll ask you two questions, and you can be as brief as possible if you want. There's one from our audience member, Jenny Tyne. She says, has the bombing of the Kerch Strait Bridge done more harm to the Ukrainian cause than good? Was there a clear objective? And then the other question from me is just, how has the Russian military occupation affected Ukrainian identities and relations within Russia? Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. Yeah, I have seen it a lot, this discussion, especially in Russian media, that the attacks that started 10 days ago on Kyiv were made in retaliation of the Kerch Bridge attack. No, it was not. I mean, Putin clearly wants it to be seen this way, but Russia was preparing attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure long ago, and they have started to do it in Kharkiv. When I was there in the city, like several times, the Russian troops hit the infrastructural object. It was back in September, before the Kerch bridge was hit. So clearly they were preparing this new, so to say, phase before the winter to create the humanitarian crisis, which is the Russian goal. And they wanted for the Russian audience, for like inner population, to see the current attacks as like their step they made to show Ukraine what is Russia is capable of, but it clearly is not. So, for example, yesterday, I don't know if you have seen that on the drone that hit the residential building in Kyiv, on the tail there was the letters for Belgorod, for Luch, which is electro station in Belgorod, meaning that they hit the residential building in turn after there were explosions in Belgorod electricity power plant. So this is how Russia tries to explain their people why are they targeting the civilian targets in Ukraine, to fuel mobilization, like to make people really angry in Russia and to make them so they would like to go and fight, which obviously is not happening because they are not happy to go in Ukraine and die for Putin, poorly trained and poorly supplied with the equipment. So basically this is the goals Russia has, and it doesn't have to do anything with the attacks on the Kerch Bridge, whoever did this, and you of course know that the Ukraine did not admit the responsibility for the attack. And for your second question, can you please remind me so that I don't lose the idea? I cannot hear you, Leon. Please.
Apologies. Very briefly, just
Yeah.
how has Russian occupation in those occupied areas that are now liberated affected the relations between those who identified formally as ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and their Ukrainian identity?
Right. So a lot of people there feel more united, more Ukrainian, so to say, because they have in their own eyes saw what Russia brings. And I have seen people crying literally when they saw the Ukrainian flags. I've been on the checkpoint from where the only road from the occupied south goes, and people get out of the cars and just cry because of the feelings they're overwhelmed when they step to the Ukrainian soil, and they say that many of them start speaking Ukrainian, but because like normally they're Russian speakers, they speak Ukrainian to show their identity, to show that they are they feel themselves Ukrainian. Of course, you know, there is an issue of people who are collaborating with the Russians, and the percentage of these people differs, but it's like what you would think it was happening in every war, and this is not the exclusion, but the vast majority of people who were living on the occupied territory, they were waiting until the moment will come and the territories will be liberated, and they will again feel themselves a part of Ukraine, and they say normally that we now feel that we returned home. Thank you again for having me, and please have a great discussion. And it was wonderful to be part of this great event.
Thank you, Mariia, and thank you again. And you feel free to drop off also. We appreciate the nuance coming from Kiev, from your perspective. Thank you. I have one quick question, both for you, Mike, and Lawrence. Mike, I'll start with you. Just very briefly, 3 realistic scenarios for the next 3 months that we need to watch out for.
Why do there have to be 3, and why do they have to be realistic? There's a lot of parameters here, Leon. Like, what's that?
Okay. Open it up as much as you want.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I don't do a lot of future gazing in this respect, because I often say that there's kind of few things as contingent in human affairs than war, and trying to predict what's going to happen, especially on such a fairly short timeline, which is the coming months of a war. A great deal can happen, and some things we may suspect, but a whole host of things we may not be able to predict. And wars, you know, they have inflection points, but this is best seen and often best written in hindsight, you know, as military history, than it is when you're living through it. That said, I'd say that probably to me, the more realistic scenarios in the coming months are: 1, Ukraine continues to make gains ahead of the winter. The war then lurches into more of an attritional phase again during the winter, which doesn't mean that there won't be fighting at all, but it just means that there'll be less offensive maneuver operations in the sense of that. And then maybe coming out later into the winter, we will likely see then a resumption of ground defenses. Right now, from my point of view, long-term Ukraine is very much advantaged based on what we know now. But we also have to be careful with straight line analysis, right? Which is the presumption that the next phase of the war will look more and more like the one we're currently in, which often doesn't necessarily end up being true. And say that's contingent on sustainability of external Western support, particularly supply of ammunition. The U.S. provided a good deal, I think, of ammunition to Ukraine ahead of this offensive period in the fall, right? But I'm not sure that it is providing ammunition at a rate that, at least right now, is sustainable given defense industrial capacity. All right, another scenario is that Russia is able to make something out of mobilization, stabilize its lines, and really improve its situation coming out of the winter. I don't think that mobilization, even optimistically, can yield much for the Russian military for another at least 3 to 4 months. So just one analyst kind of throwing a dart at the board, since you've kind of forced me to it. And it can dramatically change the quantity aspect of Russian military of the force availability, but that just means it can really extend the war. Doesn't necessarily mean it can change Russia's fortunes in the conflict. But extending the war is an important factor, because then you get the questions of economic sustainability, exhaustion, what have you. Here's a third scenario. I think this is a low probability event. I don't know how realistic it is, but since you asked the question, I'll throw it out there. There is a chance that mobilization really backfires and explodes in this regime's face, because they mobilize not in the spring for a summer offensive, but they mobilize into the winter to stabilize lines and ostensibly to hold trenches. And they're going to deploy military probably without the right amount of equipment and support. And those folks are likely to get very mad and demoralized, right? So there's a chance that this military may quit the field, or we will see some real adverse effects for the regime. They're certainly taking a gamble, and I just want to put that out as well. So I think I painted a likely scenario, what's kind of an optimistic scenario for Russia, and what I think is a pretty pessimistic scenario that's a bit of a wild card scenario, because you don't know, right? And okay, I'll leave it at that. I'd be curious to see if Sir Freedman agrees or disagrees, if he has some other thoughts that he'd like to add to his scenario. Make him also do 3 scenarios.
Lawrence, I won't put you on the spot, but I'll allow you to close us off in this session, and feel free to piggyback on anything that Mike or Mariia said to close us off. Thank you.
Well, annoyingly, I agree with Mike. I mean, I think they are the most likely. I think the wild card is not as wild. And I put it like this. I mean, Putin has set in motion things that he can't control. We can't necessarily control. This is what happened. I mean, I think Mike's emphasis on the contingent character of war is incredibly important. That's why I'm always wary about prediction as well. I'm vaguely optimistic on the Ukrainian side, quite optimistic, but war is full of pitfalls. That's why I never understood why Putin wanted to do this in the first place. You can never quite be sure how your opponent is going to react. Or there's a catastrophe of some sort. All sorts of things go on in war. So I think things are continuing, but things have been set in motion. And you can see, just not looking at it militarily so much, but politically, if you go back to that CSTO conference in Astana, this was a shambles for Putin. The lack of respect he was shown by his so-called allies, their readiness to contradict him, the readiness to keep him waiting. You feel the diminution of Russian power that's going on, the possibility of things happening. You don't have to put a high, you don't have to predict it or say it's certain, like Dagestan. I don't know what will happen in Dagestan, but it's something that ought to worry people in Moscow. We know very little about Kremlin decision-making at the moment. There's clearly quite a lot of jockeying for position goes on, as being pointed out with the Wagner Group. You can't understand what's going on unless this in Bakhmut, and that this is part of a power play in some way. Clearly, Putin was stung into a lot of his recent actions by criticisms from, not from sort of nice moderate people, but from the ultra-nationalists and hardliners. So we don't know quite how that's going to play out, but it's unstable. So things are being destabilized, and that can work out in many ways. I think there's lots of anecdotal stuff, and you can't check it, and you can't weight it, but there's a lot of anecdotal stuff on social media and elsewhere of units almost in a state of mutiny, really fed up about the situations that they're in. If the logistics fail and you're not getting decent supplies through to the front line and it's winter, you've got problems. People just won't be able to sustain it. So I think there's a lot of things to watch, but I think you've now just got to see how well the Russian state copes with the challenge of sustaining frontline forces in a country where it's not popular, where it's not welcome, where its enemy has got decent equipment, is mobilized, will also have its own problems of sustainability and cold weather kit and so on. But how well will the Russian state cope with that? And I don't know, but I think it's not unreasonable to wonder whether it will cope. Right? You know, the last thing to note is systems are very brittle. So and this is one reason why we get surprised, because you get long attritional phases, and it seems like it's going to be like that forever, and then all of a sudden it isn't. And that's true with political systems as well. So again, not a prediction. There's lots of things to watch out for, but things can change very quickly as well as just dragging on.
Thank you. And here I thought the two of you and Mariia are going to give us all the answers, but I think it's been a really thoughtful and interesting discussion. I really appreciate having all three of you on this panel, especially Mariia also in her absence. Thank you so much. And I've been waiting to have both the two of you. I've already had Mariia on this panel, but I've been waiting for the two of you for a long time. So I was very honored to have you on this discussion. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for tuning in. We'll be back on November 1st, focusing on the future of China-Russia relations. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.